Long before Socrates argued in the streets of Athens, long before 300 Spartans stood at Thermopylae, long before democracy, philosophy, or the Olympic Games, there was another Greece. A Greece of massive stone citadels with walls so thick that later Greeks thought giants must have built them. A Greece of golden death masks buried with kings whose names we still don't fully know. A Greece ruled not by senates or assemblies, but by warlords who commanded armies of bronze and chariots and controlled entire economies from the throne rooms of their palaces. We call them the Mycenaeans, and here's the thing most people never learn in school. This wasn't some primitive warm-up act before the real Greece showed up. This was a sophisticated, wealthy, terrifyingly organized civilization that dominated the Aegean world for centuries. They built roads, they ran bureaucracies with scribes tracking every jar of olive oil and every sheep in the kingdom. They fought wars, forged alliances with the great empires of the ancient Near East, and inspired legends that would echo for thousands of years afterward. When Homer wrote about Agamemnon and Achilles and the golden-walled city of Mycenae, he wasn't making it up out of thin air. He was describing, however distorted by centuries of storytelling, an actual world that had once existed and then vanished. And that's where things get strange. Because this civilization, the palace kingdoms of Mycenaean Greece, didn't fade away slowly over centuries like some empires do. The evidence increasingly suggests something much faster, much more violent, and much more mysterious. Within what might have been a single human generation, palaces burned. Trade networks collapsed. Writing itself disappeared from Greek soil for hundreds of years. A society that had been building massive fortifications and trading with Egypt and the Hittite Empire seemingly fell apart almost overnight. How does that happen? How do you go from powerful warrior kingdoms with armies, fleets, and diplomatic relationships stretching across the Mediterranean to sudden and near total collapse? That's the mystery we're going to dig into, and I mean dig, because almost everything we know about these people comes from what's literally buried in the ground. Archaeologists piecing together shattered pottery. Clay tablets baked hard by the same fires that destroyed the palaces they were stored in. Egyptian inscriptions mentioning distant lands across the sea. Hittite diplomatic letters that might, just might, name Mycenaean Greece as a rival great power. And of course Greek legend itself, the stories of Troy and Mycenae and the house of Atreus, that later Greeks told about their own forgotten ancestors, never quite realizing how much truth might be tangled up in the myth. Piece by piece we're going to walk through all of it. The rise of the palace kingdoms, the warrior elite who ruled them. The strange script called Linear B that finally let these people speak again after thousands of years of silence. And ultimately the collapse. What caused it? Whether it really happened as fast as the evidence suggests? And what was left behind when the dust settled? Before we get into it, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from right now and what time it is there. I always check the comments, and it's wild seeing this show reaching people at breakfast in one time zone and right before bed in another, all at the same moment. And if you enjoy history told this way, the best way to support the channel is by following the show on Spotify. Listen there if you can, and if you're feeling generous, leave a 5-star review. The link's right in the description. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Now, let's go back to a time before Athens, before Sparta, before Greece, as we know it even existed. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. Why does everyone know Athens? Why does everyone know Sparta? Why can most people name Socrates or picture 300 Spartans holding a mountain pass, but almost nobody outside of specialized archaeology classes has ever heard of Mycenae, Pylos, or Tiryns? It's not because the Mycenaean world was smaller. It's not because it mattered less. It's because Athens and Sparta left behind exactly the kind of evidence that survives easily and travels well across thousands of years. Written histories, philosophical texts, plays, political speeches copied and recopied by scribes for centuries, preserved in libraries, translated, taught in schools. Classical Greece talked about itself constantly, in a language later civilizations could read. Mycenaean Greece did something very different. It went silent. Not gradually, not through some slow fade into cultural irrelevance, but through catastrophic destruction followed by centuries of near-total illiteracy. When the palaces burned, the only people in Greece who could read and write burned with them, or scattered, or simply had no further use for a writing system that existed almost entirely to track palace inventories. Writing vanished from Greek soil, and once writing disappears, so does the ability of a civilization to explain itself to the future in its own words. So for close to 2,000 years, this entire world was just gone. Not physically, the stones were still there, the massive walls still stood, half buried and overgrown, but nobody remembered what they meant. Classical Greeks walked past the ruins of Mycenae and looked up at walls built from stone blocks, so enormous that later generations assumed ordinary humans couldn't have moved them. They decided giants must have done it. Specifically, they credited the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants of myth, and to this day archaeologists still call this construction style Cyclopean masonry, because that's the explanation the Greeks themselves settled on. They were staring directly at the remains of their own ancestors and concluded it must have been the work of monsters. That tells you something important right away. By the time classical Greece existed, the memory of Mycenaean Greece had already curdled into legend. Not history. Legend. Now let's fix the timeline in our heads, because this matters. We're talking about the Late Bronze Age, roughly 1600 to 1100 BCE. That's not a vague, misty prehistoric blur. That's a specific, well-defined 500-year window during which Mycenaean palace civilization rose, flourished, and then came apart. To put that in perspective, the fall of these palaces happened further back in time from Socrates than Socrates is from us. Athens and Sparta, as we usually picture them, the world of the Persian Wars, the Peloponnesian War, classical philosophy, belong mostly to the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. That's roughly 600 to 700 years after Mycenaean Greece had already collapsed and largely been forgotten. 600 to 700 years. That's the length of time separating us today from the late medieval period, from knights and castles and the early stirrings of the Renaissance. That's how far removed classical Greeks were from their own Bronze Age predecessors. And they knew almost nothing real about them. What they had instead was Homer. This is where things get genuinely fascinating, and also genuinely tricky. The Iliad and the Odyssey, composed sometime around the 8th century BCE, describe a war fought over the city of Troy, led by kings with names like Agamemnon, Menelaus, and Achilles, ruling from wealthy, gold-rich citadels like Mycenae. For a long time, people assumed this was pure fiction, elaborate storytelling with no more historical weight than any other myth. Then, in the late 1800s, a wealthy, obsessive amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann took Homer literally. He went looking for Troy and Mycenae as if they were real places waiting to be found, and he found something. Actual walls, actual gold, actual grave circles containing bodies buried with golden masks and elaborate weapons. Suddenly, a text that generations of scholars had treated as pure literary invention turned out to be pointing, at least partially, toward a real, physical, buried civilization. But here's the crucial part. The part that gets lost in the more dramatic retellings of this discovery. Homer is not a history book. He's a poet working roughly 400 to 500 years after the world he's describing had already collapsed, drawing on oral traditions passed down across many generations, traditions that had already been reshaped, exaggerated and reorganized by centuries of storytelling before he ever put them into the form we now read. Some details in Homer do seem to genuinely echo Bronze Age reality. Mycenae really is described elsewhere in the ancient world as wealthy, and archaeology confirms it really was extraordinarily rich in gold. Certain types of armour and weaponry mentioned in the poems do seem to match Bronze Age military technology rather than the technology of Homer's own later era. But other elements almost certainly reflect the world Homer actually lived in, centuries after the palaces fell, not the world he was trying to describe. The poems blend genuine ancient memory with later inventions so thoroughly that separating the two is extraordinarily difficult, and in many cases probably impossible. Homer preserved echoes. He did not preserve a transcript. So archaeology has to do most of the real work here, and archaeology tells a story that's both more solid and considerably less glamorous than epic poetry. What we can establish through excavation is concrete but limited. We can identify massive fortified citadels. We can measure the thickness of walls and calculate the sheer scale of labour required to build them. We can find storerooms, workshops, and administrative buildings. We can uncover clay tablets covered in an early Greek script recording economic transactions in mind-numbing bureaucratic detail, the number of sheep in a given district, the amount of wool allocated for a specific batch of textile production, and so on. What we cannot do, at least not with any real confidence, is reconstruct detailed political history from this evidence. We don't have a reliable list of Mycenaean kings. We don't have year-by-year royal chronicles. We don't have first-hand accounts of specific wars, specific betrayals, specific successions. Homer gives us named characters and dramatic conflict. Archaeology gives us broken pottery, burned storerooms, and administrative lists. Somewhere in the gap between those two very different kinds of evidence sits the actual history of this civilization. Mostly unreachable, partially reconstructible, endlessly debated by specialists who've spent entire careers arguing over what a single word on a single clay tablet might actually mean. One more thing worth clearing up before we go any further. The word Mycenaean itself is not something these people ever called themselves. We don't actually know what they called their own civilization, or even whether they thought of themselves as a single unified culture at all, rather than a collection of separate competing kingdoms that simply happen to share a language and general way of life. Mycenaean is a modern label invented by archaeologists and historians, and named after the site of Mycenae, specifically because that's where Schliemann made his first spectacular discoveries, and because later Greek tradition already remembered Mycenae as an especially important and wealthy place. So what we're really doing here is something closer to detective work than straightforward storytelling. We're taking fragments, ruins, burned clay records, distorted poetic memory, and diplomatic letters from neighbouring empires, and trying to piece together the shape of a civilization that never got the chance to explain itself to us directly. Before we can talk about kings and wars and collapse, we need to understand how this whole world came together in the first place. And that story starts even earlier than the palaces themselves. So what did Greece look like before Mycenae became the name we use for an entire civilization? Not like an empire, not like the world of Agamemnon. Not like a landscape dominated by giant stone fortresses and kings issuing orders from palaces. For most of the earlier Middle Bronze Age, the Greek mainland was a patchwork of small farming communities, villages clustered on hillsides in river valleys and along sheltered coasts. People grew grain, raised sheep and goats, made pottery, buried their dead, traded with their neighbours, and sometimes fought with them. There were local leaders, certainly. Some families had more land, more animals, more influence than others. But nothing on the mainland yet matched the concentrated wealth or monumental architecture emerging across the water on Crete. Because while the mainland was still divided into hundreds of small communities, Crete was doing something extraordinary. By around 2000 BCE, the Minoans had begun building the first great palaces of the Aegean. Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, Zakros. These were not fortresses in the later Mycenaean sense. They were sprawling centres of storage, religion, craft production, administration, and trade. They had storerooms full of giant jars for oil, wine, and grain, workshops producing fine pottery, textiles, metal goods, and luxury objects, complex systems of seals and writing, painted walls, plumbing, architecture on a scale the mainland had barely begun to imagine. And Crete was plugged into a much larger world. Minoan ships moved through the Aegean, linking the Greek islands, the mainland, Cyprus, Egypt, and the eastern Mediterranean. Cretan goods have turned up far beyond Crete itself. So have Cretan artistic styles. For mainland communities looking south across the sea, Crete must have appeared unimaginably wealthy. Not a distant mythical land, but a real island full of things worth acquiring: gold, ivory, fine vessels, elaborate clothing, weapons, skilled craftspeople, and maybe most important of all, access to the trade networks carrying goods from the wealthy kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean. Now, this is where the story starts getting interesting, because sometime around 1700 to 1600 BCE, a handful of communities on the Greek mainland began changing fast. Not everywhere, not all at once, but especially in the northeastern Peloponnese, around places like Mycenae. The evidence appears first not in palaces, because there were no mainland palaces yet. It appears in graves, and not ordinary graves. At Mycenae, archaeologists uncovered deep rectangular burial shafts cut into the earth. Inside were the bodies of men, women, and children from a small number of extraordinarily wealthy families. These were not people buried with a pot, a pin, and a few personal possessions. They were buried with gold, masks made from hammered sheets of gold, gold cups, gold diadems, gold ornaments sewn onto clothing, silver vessels, bronze swords, daggers decorated with hunting scenes and exotic animals, beads of amber that had travelled from somewhere in northern Europe, ivory from elephants almost certainly brought through eastern Mediterranean trade, objects made from materials that did not exist anywhere near Mycenae. One grave circle, a few generations. Enough precious metal to change how we think about early Greece. When Heinrich Schliemann uncovered these graves in the 1870s, he was so overwhelmed by the gold that he believed he had found the tomb of Agamemnon himself. He had not. The shaft graves date to roughly the 16th century BCE, probably several centuries before any possible historical setting for a Trojan War. The famous gold mask he called the Mask of Agamemnon almost certainly belonged to some other elite man whose real name is lost forever. But Schliemann was right about one thing. He had found the ancestors of the world Homer dimly remembered. Think about what those graves are telling us. Somewhere in southern Greece, certain families had gained the power to pull astonishing quantities of wealth into their own hands. Not just local wealth, international wealth. They could obtain gold from afar, amber from the north, ivory from overseas, fine goods shaped by foreign styles, and bronze weapons expensive enough that they were probably symbols of rank as much as tools of war. And then they put much of it underground. That matters, because wealth only becomes political power when other people can see it. A buried golden cup is useless to the dead, but a funeral is for the living. When an elite warrior was laid in a shaft grave wearing gold and surrounded by weapons, everyone in the community would have understood the message. This family is different. This family is powerful. This family has connections beyond this valley, beyond this region, maybe beyond Greece itself. They can command labour, They can acquire rare materials. They can arm men, and they expect their status to survive death. The shaft graves are basically an announcement before Mycenae had Cyclopean walls, before it had a palace, before it had scribes recording sheep and bronze allocations on clay tablets. It had a warrior aristocracy making itself visible in gold. But where did that aristocracy come from? For a long time, some scholars imagined a dramatic answer. They argued that a new people had arrived on the Greek mainland, perhaps Greek-speaking Indo-European warriors coming in from the north, bringing new customs, new weapons, and a more aggressive social order. There are reasons the idea became popular. The Greek language must have arrived in Greece at some point. Changes in burial customs and material culture during the Bronze Age are real, and the sudden appearance of richly armed elites can look, at first glance, like evidence of conquerors. But archaeology has made that simple invasion story much harder to defend. There is no single moment where the old mainland population vanishes and a completely new one appears. Instead, the evidence often suggests continuity. Settlements remain in use. Pottery traditions develop rather than disappear. Local communities seem to have changed over time, absorbing new ideas, new people, and new forms of prestige without necessarily being replaced wholesale. So the more cautious answer is also the more honest one. Mycenaean culture may have emerged through a mixture of processes. Greek-speaking populations could have entered the region earlier, then blended with communities already living there. Local leaders may have adopted foreign styles to distinguish themselves. New technologies, new trade routes, marriages with outside groups, and competition between neighbouring rulers may all have pushed mainland society toward greater inequality and greater militarization. In other words, we may not be looking at one conquering people suddenly creating Mycenae. We may be watching local societies transform themselves under pressure and opportunity. And the biggest opportunity was the sea. The Aegean was not a barrier. It was a highway, a dangerous highway, yes, crossed by small ships with no engines, no maps in the modern sense, and no guarantee that the weather would hold. But island chains created stepping stones between mainland Greece, Crete, the Cyclades, and the coast of Anatolia. From there, networks stretched outward toward Cyprus, the Levant, and Egypt. A mainland ruler who controlled a good harbour, a productive farming district, or a defensible hilltop was in a position to do more than feed his own people. He could trade, he could sponsor voyages, he could offer protection to merchants or take goods from them. He could send gifts to distant partners, he could bring back luxuries that made him look more powerful at home. And he could raid. We should be careful here. Archaeology rarely lets us identify a specific raid, a specific ship, or a specific battle. But the Bronze Age Mediterranean was not divided into peaceful traders on one side and violent pirates on the other. The same men may have done both. A voyage that began as exchange could turn into plunder if an opportunity appeared. A coastal settlement that could trade valuable goods could also become a target. Weapons were tools of killing, obviously, but they were also tools of status, deterrence, and negotiation. If your rivals knew you could gather armed followers, they had to treat you differently. That is why the shaft-grave weapons matter so much. Some of the finest daggers found at Mycenae are decorated with scenes of hunting, lions, and armed men. The images are stylized, influenced by Cretan art, but the message is unmistakable. Elite identity was becoming tied to controlled violence. These people wanted to be seen not merely as rich, but as dangerous. And there is a striking detail here. The mainland elites were clearly borrowing from Crete. Their art often uses Minoan motifs. Their luxury goods show Cretan influence. Cretan craftspeople may have travelled to the mainland, while mainland rulers may have imported objects or commissioned local imitations. But this was not simple copying. The people buried at Mycenae took elements from the sophisticated world of Minoan Crete and combined them with a mainland obsession with warrior display. Crete gave them a language of luxury. The mainland turned that luxury into a language of domination. Gold says you have access to distant wealth. Imported goods say you have contacts. Weapons say you can defend those contacts, exploit them, or take what you want when diplomacy fails. A lavish funeral says your family intends to keep all three advantages in the minds of everyone left behind. This is the pattern beginning to emerge across the Greek mainland in the shaft-grave era. Status, warfare, and long-distance exchange were no longer separate things. They were feeding each other. Wealth paid for followers. Followers protected wealth. Foreign connections delivered prestige goods. Prestige goods strengthened a ruler's claim to power. Competition forced rivals to seek even more wealth, more weapons, more alliances, more dramatic displays. And once that cycle starts, it can accelerate very quickly. By the 15th century BCE, the families who had filled the shaft graves were no longer just wealthy households competing for honour. Their successors were beginning to organise territories, command labour on a larger scale, and build political centres capable of controlling production and exchange. The grave goods had revealed the first stage of an elite. What came next was something far more powerful: the palace kingdom. A palace kingdom. That phrase can sound almost too neat. It makes you picture a king sitting in a shining hall, issuing commands to a united people who all know exactly where they fit. The reality was messier than that, more local, more fragile. But by around 1400 BCE, something genuinely new had appeared on the Greek mainland. The old world of competing elite families was being replaced by territorial states. At Mycenae, on its steep hill in the northeastern Peloponnese, rulers built a palace above the surrounding plain. At Tiryns, not far away, another powerful centre rose behind massive walls. Far to the southwest, Pylos controlled a rich region of Messenia, with its palace overlooking routes between the inland valleys and the sea. In central Greece, Thebes became a major power in Boeotia. Orchomenos, beside the fertile basin of Lake Copais, accumulated wealth on a scale that later Greeks still remembered. There were other centres too: Athens, Iolcos in Thessaly, possibly places in Laconia and Achaia. Not every region had the same kind of palace. Not every site survived well enough for us to understand it. But the pattern is unmistakable. Across much of mainland Greece, power was concentrating around a small number of fortified administrative centres. And these were not palaces in the modern sense. They were not private mansions where a royal family lived in isolated luxury. A Mycenaean palace was more like the command centre of an entire kingdom, part government office, part warehouse, part temple complex, part industrial zone, part royal residence, part military headquarters. Everything important seemed to flow through it. Grain came in from the countryside, olive oil, wine, wool from sheep and goats, hides, timber, honey, pottery, bronze. The palace did not necessarily own every field, every animal, or every workshop in its territory. That would be far too simple. Farmers still lived in villages. Families still worked land. Local communities retained their own identities and obligations. But the palace sat above all of them, collecting goods, redistributing supplies, organising labour, and turning the produce of hundreds or thousands of people into political power. Picture a farming village in Messenia, in the territory controlled by Pylos. The people there plant barley and wheat. They tend olive groves. They shear sheep. They make cloth. Some of what they produce stays in the village. It has to. People need food, clothing, tools, seed for next year. but some part moves upward, as taxes, rents, offerings, obligations, or deliveries demanded by the palace. The palace stores it, counts it, assigns it, uses it to feed workers, support officials, equip soldiers, reward followers, supply religious festivals, and maintain the ruler's authority. That is the basic engine of the palace system. Take resources from a wide territory, bring them to a centre, turn them into influence, then send some of them back out in ways that make everyone dependent on the centre. A shepherd might receive allocations of grain, a bronze worker might receive metal from palace stores, a group of textile workers might be given wool and ordered to produce cloth. A local official might be responsible for delivering a certain number of animals, jars of oil, or trained rowers when the palace demanded them. Religious personnel received offerings. Armed men received equipment. Messengers carried instructions between districts. Officials checked that villages were meeting their obligations. And somewhere inside the palace, scribes were keeping track. Not because Mycenaean rulers were obsessed with paperwork for its own sake. Nobody wakes up excited to count sheep, but sheep are wealth. Wool is wealth. Bronze is wealth. Grain is survival. If you can record what is owed, what has arrived, what has been distributed, and who is responsible, you can govern on a scale that a village chief never could. This was the leap. The old elites of the shaft-grave age had displayed wealth. The palace rulers learned how to manage it. They also learned how to mobilize people. Building a palace required labour. Maintaining roads required labour. Digging drainage works, constructing bridges, repairing walls, moving massive stone blocks, producing weapons, weaving textiles, preparing feasts, staffing ships, tending royal herds. None of this happens because one powerful man points at a hill and says, "Build me a kingdom." It happens because a system exists that can gather workers, feed them, supervise them, and make sure they keep coming back. That system connected the palace to nearly every part of life. The villages supplied food and labour, farms fed the population. Workshops produced pottery, perfume jars, textiles, furniture, weapons, and luxury goods. Ports linked inland kingdoms to the Aegean trade routes. Coastal stations may have watched for ships, protected harbours, and moved imported materials toward the palace centres. Local sanctuaries tied political authority to the gods. Roads and paths carried messengers, carts, animals, tribute, and soldiers between all of them. The palace was the knot in the net, and the larger the net became, the more powerful the kingdom could be. Pylos is one of the clearest examples. Its territory seems to have been divided into districts, each with local communities and officials connected to the central palace. The surviving evidence suggests an organized state capable of tracking land, livestock, personnel, religious offerings, and military resources across a substantial area. This was not Athens. It was not Rome. It was not a modern bureaucracy. But for Bronze Age Greece, it was an extraordinary concentration of administrative control. Mycenae was probably just as formidable, perhaps more famous, because of its location, its monumental ruins, and the later legends that gathered around it. It sat in a strategically important part of the Peloponnese, near routes connecting the Argolid to the Corinthian Gulf and the wider Greek mainland. Its rulers had access to fertile land, defensible heights, and maritime connections. Mycenaean goods travelled widely. Its name, centuries later, became the name we use for the entire civilization. But this creates a problem when we say Mycenaean Greece. It is easy to imagine one empire ruled from Mycenae, with every other palace obeying a high king in that famous citadel. The evidence does not really support that. There may have been moments when a particularly powerful ruler dominated his neighbours. Mycenae was clearly influential. Its wealth, military imagery, architecture and connections made it one of the leading centres in the Aegean. Later Greek tradition placed Agamemnon there and imagined him as commander of all the Greeks at Troy. That tradition may preserve distant memories of Mycenae's importance. But memory is not a map. Archaeology points instead to a patchwork of kingdoms. Pylos had its own territory, Thebes had its own sphere of influence. Orchomenos had its own wealth and local ambitions. Tiryns was close to Mycenae, perhaps sometimes subordinate, perhaps sometimes allied, perhaps sometimes a rival. The political geography could have shifted from generation to generation. Marriage alliances, trade partnerships, feuds, succession crises, raids and wars may have changed who controlled what. Think of Mycenaean Greece less like a single nation and more like a world of armed palace states. Each ruled from a central stronghold, each competing for land, labour, prestige, and access to foreign goods. Sometimes cooperating, sometimes fighting, sometimes recognizing that one king was more powerful than the others, but not necessarily united under one permanent imperial government. That distinction matters because it changes the story. A unified empire can pool its resources. It can respond to threats with one army, one strategy, one chain of command. A landscape of competing kingdoms has other strengths. Rivalry drives innovation. It pushes rulers to build stronger walls, acquire better weapons, seek farther trade connections, and prove themselves through grander projects. Competition can make everyone richer, tougher, and more ambitious. It can also make everyone suspicious, and these palace kingdoms were built on a very particular kind of strength. Their power came from concentration, concentrated food stores, concentrated craft production, concentrated records, concentrated authority, concentrated armed force. That made them impressive. A ruler could order wool from one district, workers from another, bronze from overseas, timber from mountain slopes, and food from the plains. Then he could turn all of it into ships, textiles, weapons, ceremonies, buildings, and rewards for loyal followers. The palace could reach into the countryside in ways earlier chiefs never could. But concentration has a dark side. If the palace is the knot holding the net together, what happens when the knot breaks? What happens if the ruler dies without a clear successor? If enemies burn the central storerooms? If drought reduces the harvest? If trade routes fail and bronze no longer arrives? If the workers who depend on palace rations stop receiving them? If local officials decide the centre is no longer strong enough to obey? A village can survive a bad year by relying on neighbours and local knowledge. A centralised kingdom has much more to lose. It has warehouses full of grain, workshops full of valuable materials, officials whose authority depends on records, and elites whose status depends on the palace continuing to function. The very machinery that made Mycenaean Greece powerful could make its failure catastrophic. But for now the machinery was working. Palaces were rising. Kingdoms were expanding. Greek rulers had discovered how to turn farms, villages, ports, workshops, gods, warriors, and distant trade into a system of command. And unlike the golden graves of their ancestors, this system left something even more revealing behind. Not gold, not swords, words pressed into wet clay. Words pressed into wet clay. For more than 3,000 years, nobody could read them. They were small, fragile, usually no bigger than a hand. Some were simple labels attached to containers. Others were narrow strips, rounded tablets, or leaf-shaped pieces of clay covered in neat rows of signs. They did not look like royal inscriptions meant to impress future generations. No king was boasting about his victories. No poet was recording the wrath of Achilles. No priest was explaining the secrets of the gods. These were working documents. A scribe sat in a palace office with wet clay, a sharpened stylus, and a problem to solve. How many sheep had arrived from a district which women were assigned to a textile workshop? How much grain was owed? How much bronze had been issued? Which village had supplied men, animals, cloth, oil, or weapons? The scribe pressed the answers into clay. Then the palace burned. And that disaster is why we can read the records at all. Normally, these tablets were never meant to last. Once the information was no longer useful, the clay could be soaked, flattened, and used again. It was cheap, temporary paperwork. But when fire swept through the palaces at places like Pylos, Knossos, Mycenae, and Thebes, the heat baked the tablets hard. The same destruction that ended the administrative system accidentally preserved its files. It is one of history's strangest ironies. The Mycenaeans lost their world in flames, and those flames gave them a voice. The first major discoveries came in the early 20th century. At Knossos on Crete, the British archaeologist Arthur Evans uncovered thousands of clay tablets. He realized they contained a writing system, actually more than one used in the Bronze Age Aegean. He called the earlier script Linear A, the later one, with signs written in more regular lines, he called Linear B. Evans was convinced Linear B recorded a language of the ancient Aegean. But which language? Nobody knew. The signs were not Egyptian hieroglyphs. They were not cuneiform. They were not alphabetic Greek like the letters used centuries later by Homer, Herodotus, and Plato. Linear B was a syllabic script. Most signs represented sounds like pa, tu, mi, or k. Alongside them were small pictorial symbols that helped identify things: a horse, a jar, a woman, a piece of cloth, a vessel, a weapon. For decades, scholars stared at these tablets like detectives at a crime scene. They could identify repeated patterns. They could see that some signs probably represented names, places, commodities, and numbers. They could tell that the tablets were organized, but the language behind the signs remained silent. Then came Michael Ventris. Ventris was not the kind of scholar people expected to solve one of archaeology's greatest puzzles. He was an architect, not a full-time professor of ancient languages. But he had been fascinated by Linear B since childhood. He studied the signs obsessively. He compared their patterns. He tested possible sound values. He worked through the logic of the script sign by sign. At first, many researchers assumed the language could not be Greek. The tablets from Knossos were found on Crete, and the Minoan civilization of Crete seemed older and culturally distinct from the Mycenaean kingdoms of the mainland. Linear B looked too ancient, too unfamiliar. Surely Greek, as later Greeks wrote it, must have arrived afterward. But the tablets kept pointing in another direction. In 1952, Ventris made the breakthrough. He proposed that Linear B recorded an early form of Greek. Working with the classical scholar John Chadwick, he began testing the idea against the tablets. Suddenly, words that had been meaningless clusters of signs began to make sense. Names of places appeared: Knossos, Pylos, Thebes, Amnisos. Words for grain, oil, sheep, and chariots. Names of gods that later Greeks would still know: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Hermes, and Dionysus. Not every word was immediately clear. Many still are not. But the central fact was undeniable. The Mycenaeans spoke Greek. That was the shock. Greek did not begin with the city-states of the first millennium BCE. It did not begin with Athens, Sparta, the Persian Wars, or the philosophers. It was already being written down in palace offices around 1400 BCE on Crete, and later across the mainland. The language was not identical to classical Greek. It had older forms, unfamiliar spellings, and a writing system poorly suited to some Greek sounds. But it was Greek, a very early Greek, the oldest written Greek we possess. And once the tablets could speak, They changed the Mycenaeans from legendary warriors into something more complicated. They became administrators. Open a tablet from Pylos and you do not find a heroic saga. You find sheep, hundreds of sheep, rams, ewes, lambs, herds assigned to named shepherds in named districts, wool tallies, flax, grain, figs, wine, olive oil, honey, hides, perfumed oil stored in carefully measured quantities, bronze issued to smiths, chariot wheels, swords, spearheads, axes, vessels, furniture, land holdings, taxes or obligations, though the exact nature of many payments remains debated. The palace counted everything it could turn into power. Take textiles. This was not a minor household activity. The records show large groups of women and girls assigned to textile production, often identified by their home communities or occupations. Some were wool workers, some flax workers, some may have been slaves, captives, dependents, or labourers bound to palace obligations. The tablets do not always tell us their status clearly, and that uncertainty matters. But they reveal workshops operating at a scale far beyond one family weaving cloth for itself. The palace gathered wool, it assigned workers, it tracked output, it distributed rations. This is what centralised power looks like before coins, before banks, before modern taxation. Not piles of silver moving through official treasuries, but grain, cloth, animals, oil, metal and labour flowing toward the centre, being recorded then flowing back outward again. A village delivers wool. The palace gives wool to workers. The workers produce cloth. The cloth may become clothing for officials, gifts for allies, offerings for gods, trade goods for foreign merchants, or supplies for soldiers and sailors. Every stage creates dependence. Every stage gives the palace another lever of control. And at the top of this system stood a figure named the Wanax. Later Greek tradition would use words like basileus for king. But in the Linear B tablets, the highest ruler was the Wanax, a title that later disappeared from ordinary Greek political life, but survived in poetic memory as Anax, meaning lord. The Wanax was not just a rich noble, he seems to have held a special position at the centre of the kingdom, connected to land, religious offerings, authority, and elite power. Below him appears another important title, the Loagetas. The word may mean something like leader of the people, perhaps the commander of a fighting force, or a high-ranking official with major military and landholding responsibilities. We cannot reconstruct his exact job description, the tablets are too brief for that. But the Loagetas was clearly not an ordinary man. Then there were local officials, district heads, collectors, overseers, men responsible for communities, land, herds, workshops and deliveries. The terminology can be frustratingly obscure. Some offices are understood only partly. Some may have changed from one kingdom to another. But the overall picture is clear enough. The Wanax could not rule alone. A palace kingdom depended on layers of people who knew the local villages, checked the accounts, organised labour, delivered goods, and carried orders from the centre into the countryside. The palace was powerful because it had a network, and the network was powerful because the palace could reward those who served it. But we need to be careful here. The tablets do not give us a complete blueprint of Mycenaean society. They are not a census. They are not law codes. They are not diaries. They are not secret reports explaining what people really thought about the king. Most are short, abbreviated, and written for officials who already understood the system. A single line might list a place name, a person's name, a commodity, and a number. To the scribe, that was enough. To us, 3,000 years later, it can be maddening, and almost all of them come from the final moments of palace life. They were preserved because the buildings burned. That means they may represent a particular season, a particular crisis, or records that had only recently been compiled. At Pylos, some tablets appear to record unusually intense preparations, coast watchers, weapons, rowers, movements of personnel. Were they responding to an imminent attack? Maybe. Or maybe this was routine administration that only looks ominous because we know what happened next. The tablets give us an extraordinary window, but it is a window opened by catastrophe. Still, what we see through it is remarkable. Mycenaean Greece was not merely a world of tombs, treasure and warlords shouting from chariots. It was a literate palace civilization. Its rulers governed through measurements, categories, obligations and records. They knew which districts owed livestock. They knew how much wool was available. They knew which workers could be mobilized. They knew where bronze was going and who was responsible for it. A warrior kingdom, yes, but behind every sword was an account. Behind every feast a delivery list. Behind every fortified citadel, clerks pressing numbers into clay. And those numbers point toward the man at the centre of it all. The Wanax, the Wanax. We know the title. We know he stood at the top. But the man himself remains almost invisible. No portrait has survived with a name beneath it. No royal biography tells us when he was born, whom he married, which enemies he defeated, or how he died. The Mycenaean palaces did not leave behind the kind of monumental kingly propaganda found in Egypt or Mesopotamia. No giant statues, no walls covered in campaigns, no inscriptions announcing I am the great king, conqueror of nations. Instead, the Wanax appears in accounting records. A plot of land associated with the Wanax, offerings assigned to the Wanax, officials operating within a system whose highest point was clearly his household and his authority. It is frustratingly little, but it is enough to show that this was not simply the richest nobleman in a loose alliance of aristocrats. The Wanax was something more. He seems to have been the palace king, the figure at the centre of political power, religious prestige, landholding, redistribution, and military leadership. The palace gathered goods. The palace assigned labour. The palace organised workshops. And the Wanax stood at the summit of that entire machine. Think about what that meant. If you controlled the palace stores, you had access to grain when harvests failed. You had bronze when weapons needed making. You had perfumed oil, fine cloth, livestock, imported goods, and prestige objects that could reward allies. You could feed retainers. You could support priests. You could send gifts to distant rulers. You could equip men for war. In the Bronze Age, power was not an abstract idea. It was stored in jars, herds, weapons, textiles, land, and people. And the Wanax had his hands on the valves. But do not picture a later Greek king. This is not Athens, with citizens debating policy in an assembly. It is not Sparta, with its two hereditary kings constrained by councils, magistrates, and a famously rigid social order. Those worlds came centuries later, after the palaces had fallen and Greece had been rebuilt in a completely different political form. The Mycenaean kingdom was centralized around a palace. Its ruler was not merely first among equals, he was the apex of an administrative hierarchy that reached from fortified citadel to rural district. How absolute his authority really was, we cannot say. Local elites clearly mattered. Powerful families held land, commanded followers, and ran regional affairs. A king who alienated too many of them would have had a problem. But the system was built to make one household exceptional. The Wanax's household was not just his family, it was a political institution. Around him stood officials, messengers, scribes, religious personnel, craftsmen, guards, drivers, armourers, and elite followers whose status depended on their connection to the palace. Some may have been bound by personal loyalty, others by land grants, privileges, office, kinship, or access to wealth. Most were probably tied together by all of these at once. That is how palace power worked. Not through one man barking orders into empty space, but through networks of obligation. A local leader delivers cattle or wool. A palace official records it. The palace redistributes food, cloth, weapons, or land rights. The local leader gains status. His followers benefit. In return, he helps maintain the king's authority, mobilize labour, and provide men when danger comes. It is a system that can look stable for generations. And then, when the centre breaks, every connection can become a weakness. The warrior elite sat near the heart of this arrangement. Linear B records chariots, wheels, horses, armour, weapons, and personnel connected with military activity. It names men who may have served as chariot fighters or officers. It tracks bronze issued to smiths for spearheads, swords, and other equipment. At Pylos, records mention watchers assigned along the coast and rowers connected to naval obligations. The exact context is debated. Were these emergency preparations before the palace's final destruction? Routine defence? A seasonal mobilization? We do not know. But the palace was clearly capable of organising armed manpower on a scale beyond a single village feud. And for the men at the top, war was not only a necessity. It was a language of status. A Mycenaean elite man announced himself through things that could kill and things that gleamed. A long, thrusting spear, a bronze sword, a carefully made shield, armour that required metal, leather, cloth, and skilled labour, horse gear, chariot fittings, gold ornaments, imported materials, feasting equipment. Every object said the same thing. I have access to resources you do not. The boar-tusk helmet is one of the strangest symbols of this world. Later, Homer describes warriors wearing helmets made from the tusks of wild boars, sewn in rows onto a leather cap. For centuries it sounded almost too specific, too archaic, maybe even poetic invention. Then, archaeologists found them. Actual boar-tusk helmet fragments have appeared in Mycenaean graves and settlements. To make one helmet, hunters had to kill many boars, extract the curved tusk plates, shape them, drill them, and attach them in overlapping rows. It was practical enough to offer protection, but it was also a statement. A helmet made from dozens of tusks advertised hunting skill, labour, wealth, and elite identity before a warrior had even raised his spear. Weapons worked the same way. Swords could be deadly tools. They could also be grave goods, heirlooms, diplomatic gifts, and visible badges of rank. Spears were likely the more common battlefield weapon, useful in massed fighting and much cheaper than a long bronze sword. Shields came in different forms, though the evidence is incomplete and changes over time. Fresco seals, weapons deposits, and graves give us fragments of the picture, not a single standardized Mycenaean army manual. That uncertainty matters. The Mycenaeans did not necessarily fight like the hoplites of classical Greece, shoulder to shoulder behind round shields in disciplined phalanxes. That image belongs to a later age. Nor should we imagine every noble racing into battle like a Homeric hero, alone in a chariot, looking for personal glory. The chariot itself is a perfect example. Chariots appear frequently in palace records, and they were clearly expensive military assets. But how were they used as mobile platforms for elite fighters, as transport bringing warriors to the battlefield before they fought on foot? As symbols of rank used in parades, hunting and ceremonial display as much as war? Different scholars have argued for different answers. The evidence does not let us be certain. What it does show is that horses and chariots were controlled by the palace, maintained by specialists, and associated with the highest levels of society. A chariot was Bronze Age power on wheels. It required horses, breeding, training, woodworkers, leather workers, metal fittings, drivers, storage, and constant maintenance. You did not own one because you were an ordinary farmer. And then there is the armour from Dendra, found in a tomb near Argos. This remarkable suit dates to the 15th century BCE. It is made from large overlapping bronze plates, designed to cover the torso, shoulders, neck and parts of the lower body. There were greaves, there were arm defences, there was even a helmet. Put together, it looks almost futuristic, more like something from a later age of metal-clad warriors than the loose tunics many people imagine when they think of ancient Greece. It proves Mycenaean armourers could produce sophisticated protective equipment. But it also creates a mystery. Could a man fight effectively on foot while wearing it? Possibly, though movement would have been restricted. Was it intended for chariot combat, where heavy protection made more sense? Maybe. Was this a rare ceremonial suit, the equipment of one exceptionally wealthy warrior, rather than standard issue for an army? Very likely, one spectacular find cannot tell us exactly how every Mycenaean battle was fought, but it tells us something important about the world that made it. This was a society with the resources, craftsmanship, and social inequality to place a man inside a shell of bronze. A society where protection was expensive, where violence was expected, where an elite warrior could become a walking display of palace wealth. So was Mycenaean Greece a warrior empire? In one sense, yes. The palace kingdoms were heavily fortified. Their rulers invested in weapons, chariots, defences, and armed personnel. Elite identity was saturated with warfare, hunting, raiding, and the ability to command men. Mycenaean rulers also operated in an Eastern Mediterranean world where diplomacy and violence were often inseparable. Gifts could become tribute, trade routes could become targets. A distant ally could become an enemy with very little warning. But the phrase can mislead us. There is no clear evidence that all of Mycenaean Greece was united under one emperor commanding a single Greek army. Mycenae, Pylos, Thebes, Tiryns, and other centres may have been rival kingdoms as often as partners. Their political boundaries are still debated. Their military campaigns are mostly lost. The linear B tablets reveal preparations and institutions, not grand narratives of conquest. This was not Rome, it was not Alexander's empire, it was not Sparta ruling the Peloponnese. It was a patchwork of palace states, each built around a ruler who needed warriors, and warriors who needed a ruler capable of feeding, equipping, rewarding, and remembering them. The Wanax stood at the centre of that bargain. He was king, landholder, ritual figure, and likely war leader. But his power depended on bronze arriving from distant lands, grain moving in from the countryside, scribes keeping accounts, local elites staying loyal, and armed men believing the palace was still strong enough to protect them. That belief was written into stone walls, gold masks, chariots, swords, and armour. And nowhere was it more visible than in the great citadels rising above the Greek landscape. And nowhere was it more visible than in the great citadels rising above the Greek landscape. Picture approaching Mycenae in the 13th century BCE. You are moving through the Argolid, a broad plain in the northeastern Peloponnese. Fields stretch below. Roads and paths connect farms, villages, tombs, and smaller settlements. But ahead of you, rising from a rocky hill, is something that does not look like an ordinary town. It looks like a warning. Mycenae was built high enough to command the surrounding landscape. From its walls, defenders could watch movement across the plain, monitor routes toward the coast, and see anyone coming long before they reached the gates. The palace was not hidden among the people. It stood above them, enclosed in stone, physically separated from the countryside that fed it. That position was practical. High ground is easier to defend. But it was also political. Every farmer bringing grain, every herder delivering animals, every trader arriving with goods, every local leader coming to meet palace officials had to look up at the citadel. The architecture delivered the message before anyone spoke. The palace is above you. The rulers are protected. And if necessary, they can close the gates. The walls themselves were astonishing. Huge blocks of limestone, sometimes roughly fitted together without mortar, created fortifications so massive that later Greeks could barely imagine human beings building them. They called this style Cyclopean masonry, because surely they thought only the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants of myth, could have lifted stones this large. That name stuck. Even today, standing beside the surviving walls of Mycenae or Tiryns, it is easy to understand the reaction. Some blocks weigh many tons. They were quarried, transported, raised, positioned, and fitted by organized labor on a scale that required planning, authority, food supplies, skilled workers, and probably a great many unwilling backs. These walls were not built by a few villagers hoping to keep out bandits. They were state projects, and state projects always raise a question. What were they afraid of? At Mycenae, the most famous entrance is the Lion Gate. Two great stone jambs support an enormous lintel, above which sits a carved relief of two lions, or possibly lionesses, flanking a central column. Their heads are missing, likely made separately from another material, but their bodies remain poised above everyone passing beneath them. It is the earliest monumental sculpture known from mainland Greece. And it is not subtle. The lions may have symbolized royal authority, divine protection, or the power of the palace itself. The central column could represent a sanctuary, a royal household, or a religious symbol whose meaning has been lost. Archaeologists can debate the details, but nobody entering that gate would have missed the larger point. This was not just a doorway, it was a stage-managed encounter with power. Pass through it, and the route turns and narrows. Defenders above and beside the entrance could control access. Beyond lay the citadel, buildings, workshops, shrines, residences, storerooms, administrative spaces, and eventually the palace complex itself, with its central megaron. The megaron was the ceremonial heart of the palace. A large hall with a central hearth surrounded by columns, where the ruler and his court may have held feasts, rituals, audiences, and political gatherings. This was where power became visible, where goods from the countryside could be consumed in elite feasts, where gifts could be given, where alliances could be made, where a local leader might be rewarded, humbled, threatened, or all three in the same afternoon. Below and around these elite spaces were the systems that made palace power possible. Storerooms held large jars for oil, wine, grain, and other supplies. Workshops produced valuable goods. Roads linked the citadel to the surrounding territory. At Mycenae, engineers even constructed an underground cistern system accessed by a long descending passage within the walls. In a siege, water could mean survival. A city with food but no water was trapped. A city with hidden access to water could hold out longer. That is an extraordinary thing to build. It suggests that somebody was thinking not merely about prestige, but about the possibility of being surrounded. Tiryns, only a short distance away in the same Argolid plain, made the same argument in a different language. If Mycenae sits on a rocky hill like a clenched fist, Tiryns spreads across a long, low limestone ridge. Its walls are even more overwhelming in places, broad enough to contain internal galleries and passageways. These were not solid barriers alone. They were complex defensive structures with corridors running through the thickness of the masonry, protected routes, carefully designed entrances and spaces that could serve guards, storage, or movement during a crisis. Later, visitors stared at Tiryns and saw giants at work. Modern archaeology sees administration, engineering, and labour control. Tiryns had a palace, a megaron, storerooms, courtyards, workshops, and a carefully managed approach. It was clearly connected to the same Mycenaean world as Mycenae. The rulers used related architectural traditions. They wrote the same Linear B script. They participated in the same elite culture of feasting, warfare, religion, and palace administration. But they were not simply the same place twice. Mycenae became the name remembered by later Greek tradition, attached to Agamemnon and the expedition against Troy. Tiryns became associated with Heracles, another hero of impossible strength. Archaeology cannot confirm the kings of myth, but it does show that both were major centres, powerful enough to organise landscapes and labour, and close enough that their relationship must have mattered enormously. Were they allies, rivals, one subordinate to the other at certain times? Independent kingdoms navigating the same dangerous plane? The evidence does not give us a final answer, and that uncertainty is important, because these walls may not have been aimed only at enemies from across the sea. Mycenaean Greece was not one unified nation. Palace kingdoms could compete for land, trade routes, labour and prestige. A fortified citadel could defend against foreign raiders, yes, but it could also intimidate neighbouring Greeks. It could protect a ruler from local rivals. It could secure palace stores during famine. It could provide refuge during rebellion, dynastic struggle, or the sudden collapse of trust between the king and the people he ruled. Architecture can reveal fear, but it can also create it. A wall tells outsiders, "Stay back." It tells subjects, "This power is permanent." It tells elites the palace has resources beyond yours. And it tells the ruler inside that he may survive when the fields below become dangerous. The trouble is, stone can protect a palace without protecting the system that supports it. Walls cannot grow grain. They cannot replace lost trade. They cannot force distant allies to remain loyal. They cannot stop an earthquake, a drought, a succession crisis, or a rebellion spreading through the countryside. Still, for generations, the citadels stood Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, fortified centres of a warrior world, watching roads, guarding wealth and projecting strength across the Greek landscape. And beyond that landscape lay an even larger world, Anatolian kings, Egyptian pharaohs, Cypriot copper, Levantine ports, sea routes, diplomatic gifts, pirates, merchants, mercenaries and enemies. The Mycenaean palaces had built walls against danger, but danger was coming from far more directions than any wall could face. Because the Mycenaean palaces were not isolated fortresses at the edge of the world. They were nodes in one of the first truly international systems in history. In the 13th century BCE, the eastern Mediterranean was alive with movement. Ships crossed between islands and coastlines, carrying cargoes, messages, soldiers, slaves, diplomats, craftsmen, and rulers. A ruler in mainland Greece might never see the pharaoh of Egypt or the great king of the Hittites. But objects from their worlds could sit in his storerooms. His own goods could travel hundreds, even thousands of miles beyond the walls of his citadel. This was the Bronze Age version of globalization, and like every global system, it created wealth by connecting distant places. It also created new ways for everything to go wrong. Start with the sea. From the Argolid, ships could move south to Crete, the great island civilization that had dominated the Aegean before the Mycenaean palaces rose to power. By the later Bronze Age, Crete was no longer the centre of an independent Minoan empire, if it had ever been one in the modern sense. Mycenaean Greek speakers had established themselves at Knossos centuries earlier, and Mycenaean-style material culture appears across the island. But Crete still mattered. Its harbours, workshops, religious traditions, and position between mainland Greece, the Cyclades, Cyprus, and Egypt made it a critical link in the network. Move east from Crete, and the routes opened into Anatolia, the huge peninsula that is now Turkey. There stood the Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the age. Southward lay the Levant, a chain of coastal cities in modern Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine, crowded with ports and trading communities. Beyond them was Egypt, rich, centralized, and ruled by pharaohs whose court consumed luxury goods from across the known world. Further east was Cyprus, and Cyprus was essential. The island possessed abundant copper deposits. Copper was the foundation of bronze. Mix copper with tin, and you get a harder, more durable metal, bronze. Bronze for swords, spearheads, knives, axes, tools, vessels, armour fittings, and prestige goods. A palace that wanted weapons for its warriors and tools for its workers needed bronze, and that meant it needed copper. But copper alone was not enough. Tin was rarer and more difficult to obtain. Its precise routes into the eastern Mediterranean are still debated. Some may have come through Anatolia, perhaps ultimately from regions farther east. Other supplies may have moved through long chains of exchange from Central Asia or from sources in the West. Archaeologists are still tracing the chemistry of ancient metals, trying to reconstruct supply lines that vanished more than 3,000 years ago. What matters is this. No Mycenaean kingdom could simply walk into its own backyard and guarantee everything it needed. Bronze depended on distant mines, distant merchants, distant ports, and distant political relationships. A sword carried by a Mycenaean warrior may have begun as copper mined in Cyprus, and tin brought through networks so long that no single person understood the entire journey. That is power, but it is also dependence. The archaeological evidence for these connections is everywhere. Mycenaean pottery has been found in places as far apart as Cyprus, the Levant, Egypt, and southern Italy. These distinctive painted vessels, with their spirals, sea creatures, chariots, and geometric patterns, were not always luxury objects themselves. Sometimes they were containers for valuable commodities, perfumed oil, wine, perhaps other goods now vanished. But their presence tells us that Mycenaean products, or at least Mycenaean-style products, were moving far beyond Greece, and things came back. Ivory, likely sourced from elephants in Egypt, Syria, or farther south, reached Mycenaean workshops and was carved into fine furniture, inlays, ornaments, and decorative objects. Glass, still a rare and expensive material, arrived as coloured beads and raw material for elite goods. Amber from the Baltic somehow travelled south, through astonishingly long exchange routes. Gold, silver, exotic stones, dyed textiles, incense, and crafted luxury items flowed through the same interconnected world. Think about what that means. A ruler sitting in a palace at Pylos or Mycenae could display wealth that came from forests near the Baltic Sea, mines in Cyprus, elephant herds far to the south, and workshops on the Syrian coast. His power was local, his image was international. The same was probably true of people. Not every traveller left a name behind. Most did not. But the sea lanes carried more than cargo. Mycenaean merchants likely negotiated in foreign harbours. Palace emissaries may have delivered gifts, messages, and requests between courts. Craftsmen could move where demand and opportunity took them. Mercenaries served rulers far from home throughout the Bronze Age world. Raiders did too. The categories could overlap. A ship might arrive as a trading vessel in one season, carry armed guards in the next, and become a raiding party when politics changed or supplies ran short. In an age without modern passports or national borders, merchant, pirate, mercenary, and diplomat could be roles played by the same people under different circumstances. The famous shipwreck found at Uluburun, off the coast of southern Anatolia, gives us a glimpse of this world in motion. It sank around 1300 BCE, carrying a cargo that included copper ingots from Cyprus, tin, glass ingots, ivory, luxury goods, and materials from multiple regions. It was not necessarily a Mycenaean ship, but it proves the scale of the system the Mycenaeans inhabited. This was not simple village-to-village barter, it was high-value trade organised across kingdoms, and the palace economies of Greece were built to benefit from it. The rulers collected agricultural surplus from their territories, directed workshops, controlled prestige goods, equipped warriors, and used foreign luxuries to reward followers and display status. A rare object from Egypt or the Levant was not just beautiful. It was evidence that the palace had reach. It had contacts. It had access to worlds beyond the horizon. But every link in that chain was vulnerable. A storm could sink a ship. Pirates could seize a cargo. A war between major powers could close a port. A rebellion could interrupt production at a mine. A drought could turn grain shipments into desperate necessities. A foreign king could decide that gifts were no longer enough, that he wanted tribute, soldiers, or territory. The more connected the palaces became, the more they depended on forces they could not control. And somewhere in the records of the Hittite Empire, rulers in Anatolia began writing about a power across the sea. They called it Ahhiyawa. Ahhiyawa. To a modern reader, the name sounds unfamiliar. But say it slowly, and the resemblance becomes hard to ignore. Ahhiyawa, Achaea, Achaeans. That was the name later Greek tradition used for the Greeks who fought at Troy. Homer calls them Achaeans again and again, and in clay tablets written by the Hittites, the rulers of Anatolia, a distant power across the Aegean, appears under a strikingly similar name. Many scholars believe Ahhiyawa was the Hittite name for Mycenaean Greece, or at least for a major Mycenaean political power. Not everyone agrees. The texts are incomplete. The geography is often difficult, and Bronze Age names can travel in strange ways. But the phonetic connection is powerful. Ahhiyawa looks very much like a Hittite attempt to write the name of the Achaeans. If that identification is right, then the Mycenaeans were not merely traders whose painted pottery happened to wash up in foreign ports. They were players in the diplomatic and military struggles of the Eastern Mediterranean. And the Hittites took them seriously. The Hittite Empire was centered in Anatolia, with its capital at Hattusa, far inland in what is now central Turkey. From there, Hittite kings ruled a vast and difficult empire. They fought Egypt. They controlled or influenced much of Anatolia and northern Syria. They dealt with rebellions, border wars, rival princes, restless vassals, and the constant problem of keeping distant territories loyal. To govern this world, they wrote treaties, orders, legal rulings, military reports, letters to allies and enemies. Thousands of clay tablets survived because fire, one of history's great destroyers, also baked them hard enough to last for millennia, and among those tablets are references to Ahhiyawa. The earliest mentions are frustratingly brief. A place or people called Ahhiyawa appears in Hittite records from the 15th and 14th centuries BCE, often in connection with Western Anatolia. But the picture becomes clearer in the 13th century, when Hittite kings were dealing with a region full of divided local states, ambitious warlords, and coastal territories vulnerable to intervention from across the sea. Western Anatolia was the pressure point. This was not yet Turkey in any modern national sense. It was a patchwork of kingdoms and city-states. Arzawa, the Siha Riverland, Mira, Lucca, Walusa, and others. Some were Hittite vassals, some rebelled, some shifted sides when it suited them. Their rulers had local grudges, old family claims, and every reason to call in outside help if the Hittite great king became too demanding. And somewhere beyond the water was Ahhiyawa. The Hittites clearly believed its rulers could influence events on the Anatolian coast. They could shelter fugitives. They could support troublemakers. They could intervene in disputes involving Hittite subjects. They may have controlled settlements or strongholds somewhere in the Aegean or on the Anatolian mainland. Exactly where their authority began and ended is still debated. That uncertainty matters. There was probably no single Mycenaean empire in the modern sense, ruled from one capital with fixed borders and a single bureaucracy controlling every Greek-speaking kingdom. The palaces at Mycenae, Pylos, Thebes and elsewhere had their own rulers and interests. But foreign powers often simplify what they see beyond their borders. The Hittites may have used Ahhiyawa for one dominant Aegean ruler, one coalition, a particular mainland kingdom, or a broader Mycenaean world that looked more unified from Anatolia than it really was. Still, one document is especially revealing. It is known today as the Tawagalawa letter. A Hittite king, probably Hattusili III in the 13th century BCE, wrote to the king of Ahhiyawa about a dangerous man named Piamaradu. Piamaradu was a local troublemaker, perhaps a rebel leader or warlord, who had attacked Hittite clients in western Anatolia and repeatedly escaped punishment. According to the Hittite account, he found protection in territory connected to Ahhiyawa. Now, picture the situation. The great king of the Hittites, ruler of one of the most powerful states on earth, is not writing to a minor pirate chief. He is addressing another ruler with careful diplomatic language. At one point, the Ahhiyawan king is called my brother, the term used in Bronze Age diplomacy for fellow great kings. Egypt's pharaoh was a brother. Babylon's king was a brother. Assyria's king, when its status was accepted, could be a brother. And apparently the king of Ahhiyawa could be a brother too. There is a complication. In the surviving version of the letter, that prestigious title appears to have been erased or altered perhaps by a later scribe, or because relations changed. Scholars argue over exactly what the damaged text means. But the broader message remains extraordinary. The Hittite king treated Ahhiyawa as a power important enough to negotiate with, complain to, and attempt to manage through diplomacy. Not conquer, negotiate. The letter is almost painfully human. The Hittite king recalls an earlier dispute between their countries over a place called Wilusa. He says, in effect, that they had once been at odds but had now reached agreement. Then he asks the Ahhiyawan king to stop protecting Piamaradu and help bring the crisis under control. It sounds like the language of international politics in any age. Your client attacked my ally. Your territory gave him refuge. We settled our last disagreement. Now keep your people under control. And that name, Wilusa, opens another door. Most scholars connect Wilusa with the later Greek name Ilios, another name for Troy. The linguistic path is plausible, Wilusa becoming something like Wilios, then Ilios in Greek tradition. Wilusa was located in northwestern Anatolia, probably in or near the region of Hisarlik, the archaeological site widely identified with Bronze Age Troy. Again, caution is necessary. A Hittite reference to Wilusa does not prove Homer's Trojan War happened exactly as later poets described it. It does not prove that a Mycenaean king led a united Greek army across the sea because of Helen, Achilles, or a wooden horse. But it does show something remarkable. A real place associated with Troy existed in Hittite diplomatic geography. It was politically important. It stood in a contested region, and the Hittites remembered a prior disagreement with Ahhiyawa involving it. Suddenly, the old legend no longer looks like it emerged from nowhere. It may preserve a distant memory of real tensions around the Anatolian coast, not a transcript of history, not a reliable eyewitness account, but perhaps an echo, distorted through centuries of oral storytelling, of a world where Aegean rulers and Anatolian kings competed over strategic cities, trade routes, loyalties, and access to the sea. The Hittite tablets give us no image of Mycenaean Greeks in their own words. They do not tell us which palace ruled Ahhiyawa, how many ships it possessed, or whether its king sat at Mycenae, Thebes, Pylos, or somewhere now lost. But they reveal how the Mycenaean world looked from the outside, not remote, not provincial, not safely hidden behind its Cyclopean walls. At the edge of the Hittite Empire, across a narrow and dangerous sea, the palace rulers of Greece had become entangled in great power politics. And one disputed city, Wilusa, may hold the first historical shadow of Troy. So, was there really a Trojan War? The honest answer is both more interesting and less satisfying than the legend. There may have been a war, there may have been several, but the evidence does not let us recover Homer's story as history. No archaeologist has found Helen's palace. No tablet records Achilles killing Hector outside the gates. No inscription says that Agamemnon assembled every king in Greece, sailed 1,000 ships across the Aegean, and destroyed Troy after 10 years of siege. The Trojan horse is even more elusive. It may be a poetic invention. It may preserve some forgotten memory of siege machinery, an earthquake symbol, or a trick that later storytellers transformed into the greatest deception in Greek myth. What we have instead is a real city, a real region of conflict, and a legend that may contain fragments of a real Bronze Age past. The site most commonly identified with Troy is Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey. It sits near the entrance to the Dardanelles, the narrow waterway connecting the Aegean to the Sea of Marmara, and beyond that, the Black Sea. This was not some isolated hill at the edge of nowhere. It stood near a strategic crossing point between Anatolia and Europe, beside sea routes that connected worlds. And for thousands of years people lived there. Archaeologists call the successive settlements at Hisarlik Troy I, Troy II, Troy III, and so on. Each city was built over the ruins of the last, creating a mound layered with the debris of generations. The Troy relevant to the Mycenaean age is not the tiny settlement first imagined by early treasure hunters. It is mainly Troy VI and Troy VII, large late Bronze Age communities with substantial defences and an inhabited lower town spreading beyond the citadel walls. Troy VI was destroyed around 1300 BCE, probably by an earthquake. Its walls had collapsed in ways that suggest natural disaster more than battle. But then came Troy VII to A. This city was rebuilt quickly, in a more crowded and anxious form. Houses were packed tightly together. Large storage jars were sunk into floors, perhaps to hold emergency supplies. And around 1180 BCE, during the wider collapse of the Bronze Age world, Troy the Sevendea was destroyed by fire. Was that the Trojan War? Possibly, but possibly is doing a lot of work. A burned city does not tell us who burned it. It could have been an attack from across the sea. It could have been a local Anatolian rival. It could have been a revolt, a raid, a civil conflict, or chaos connected to the regional disasters sweeping through the eastern Mediterranean. Bronze Age cities did not need Homeric armies to die violently. But the Hittite records make the question harder to dismiss. They tell us that Wilusa, probably Troy, was a real political entity in western Anatolia. They tell us that the Hittites worried about instability in this region. They tell us that Ahhiyawa, probably a Mycenaean power, had enough influence there to become involved in disputes, and they preserve a memory of an earlier conflict over Wilusa between the Hittites and Ahhiyawa. That is not proof of a single great war, but it is exactly the kind of political environment from which such stories can grow. Imagine generations of tension around the Aegean coast, Mycenaean raiders attacking ports, Anatolian rulers changing sides, Hittite governors trying to hold their vassals together, a disputed city controlling access to vital sea lanes, one palace backing a local claimant, another sending ships, a siege that lasts weeks, not 10 years, a city captured, abandoned, rebuilt, and attacked again. Then imagine those events remembered for centuries after the palaces themselves vanished. The Bronze Age had no surviving Greek historical chronicles to preserve the details. What remained were names, places, family memories, songs about ships and kings, and stories carried by poets from one generation to the next. Over time, separate conflicts could merge into one enormous war. Several rulers could become one supreme commander. A local raid could become a decade-long siege. A damaged city could become the stage for gods, heroes, destiny, and the most beautiful woman in the world. That is why Homer cannot simply be accepted or rejected. The poems were composed centuries after the Mycenaean palace age ended. They preserve real-looking details from that older world, including boar's tusk helmets, chariot warfare, and powerful kings ruling fortified centres. But they also contain features of the later Iron Age, along with pure poetry and supernatural drama. Homer's Troy is not a Bronze Age document, it is memory reshaped into epic, and the famous coalition of all Greek kings remains especially uncertain. The Linear B tablets show many palace kingdoms, each with its own administration, territory, and elite. The Hittite texts suggest Ahhiyawa could act as a major outside power, but neither source records a united Greek expedition under a king of Mycenae. Agamemnon may preserve the memory of a powerful ruler, or he may be a later poetic creation built from several royal traditions. So the Trojan War stands at the boundary between history and myth. There was likely a Troy. There was likely a Wilusa. There were real Mycenaean powers across the sea. There were real conflicts in the region. But between those hard fragments of evidence and Homer's immortal story lies a gulf of centuries. A gulf filled with memory, and memory, like war, leaves ruins behind. But memory usually remembers kings. It remembers the man who led the ships, the ruler behind the Cyclopean walls, the warrior buried with gold at Mycenae. It remembers the palace burning on the hill. What it does not remember nearly as well are the people who made that palace possible. The farmers cutting grain under the summer sun, the herders moving sheep through the hills, the women spinning wool day after day for palace workshops, the bronze workers, potters, leather workers, rowers, builders, millers, carriers and labourers, whose names rarely survived beyond a few marks pressed into wet clay. If the Mycenaean world was an empire of warriors, it was also an empire of workers, and the Linear B tablets, dry and administrative as they can seem, give us brief flashes of their lives. A palace did not produce its own food. It depended on a countryside of villages, fields, orchards, pastures and small workshops. The land around Pylos, Mycenae, Thebes and Knossos was worked by people who grew wheat and barley, tended olives and vines, kept pigs and goats, and above all raised sheep. Grain meant bread, porridge and beer-like drinks. Olives meant oil, one of the most valuable substances in the Bronze Age. Oil could be eaten, burned in lamps, used in perfumes, offered to gods, and stored for years. And sheep meant wool. The palace records track flocks with remarkable care, not because palace scribes were fascinated by animals, but because every sheep represented future cloth. A flock was counted, its expected wool yield was calculated, its keepers were identified. If the numbers did not add up, somebody had questions to answer. This was not modern bureaucracy, but it was bureaucracy all the same. The palace reached beyond its walls through officials, collectors, local leaders, and storehouses. It gathered goods from the surrounding territory, redistributed supplies, supported specialists, funded religious ceremonies, and maintained the elite households at the top of the system. Imagine the yearly rhythm. In spring, lambs are born and flocks are moved to fresh pasture. In early summer, sheep are shorn. Grain is harvested before dry weather or sudden storms can ruin it. Grapes are gathered in autumn. Olives come later. Wine is stored. Oil is pressed. Animals are slaughtered for feasts, sacrifices, or preserved meat. Wood, clay, flax, hides, honey, spices, and metals all move along the same channels toward the centers of power. The tablets do not tell us what every ordinary person thought about this system. They were written by palace officials, not by farmers. But they make one thing clear. The palace was deeply involved in organizing production. Not every field was directly owned by the king. The evidence suggests a complicated landscape of palace land, local community land, religious land, and holdings controlled by powerful individuals. Villages had their own structures and local obligations. But when the palace needed grain, wool, animals, labour, or military equipment, it possessed the authority to demand them. And nowhere is this clearer than in the textile industry. For the Mycenaean palaces, cloth was not just clothing, it was wealth. Fine textiles could be worn by elites, offered to deities, exchanged with foreign powers, used to reward officials, or sent abroad as gifts. Wool cloth was one of the great products of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, portable, valuable, and difficult to make in large quantities without organized labor. At Pylos and Knossos, Linear B tablets record groups of women workers in astonishing detail. They appear as spinners, weavers, cloth finishers, and workers connected to particular places or occupations. Some are listed with children. Some receive rations of grain, figs, and wine. The tablets sometimes identify them by ethnic labels that may indicate women brought from elsewhere in the Aegean or Anatolia. This has led many scholars to conclude that at least some of these workers were unfree, perhaps captives or enslaved people controlled by the palace. But the exact legal status of every person listed remains uncertain. The tablets are accounting documents. They tell us who received rations. They do not tell us whether those workers could leave, own property, marry freely, or refuse orders. Still, the larger picture is hard to miss. Women were central to one of the palace economy's most important industries. Their labour was counted, organised and converted into the cloth that helped sustain elite power. A king's embroidered garment, a priestess's offering, or a diplomatic gift carried the work of hundreds of hands behind it. The same was true of religion. The Mycenaeans did not separate the sacred world from the administrative world the way modern people might expect. The gods received offerings, but offerings had to be collected, stored, measured, and delivered. Sanctuaries needed oil, wine, grain, honey, animals, perfumes, and textiles. Festivals required food and labour. Religious officials appear in the records alongside landholders, shepherds, and palace administrators, and some of the divine names are instantly familiar. Zeus appears, so does Hera. Poseidon appears frequently, and may have been especially important in the Mycenaean world. There is also Dionysus, centuries before the great festivals of classical Greece. Other figures are harder to understand. Powerful goddesses called Potnia, meaning mistress, and deities whose identities may have changed or disappeared after the palaces fell. This is one of the strangest connections between Mycenaean Greece and the Greece that came later. The temples, myths, and city-states of the classical world did not yet exist. But some of the gods were already there, receiving oil and grain from palace storehouses, their names pressed into clay by scribes who could never have imagined that people would still speak those names 3,000 years later. Religion helped bind the palace world together, so did feasting. A major ceremony could bring communities into contact with the centre, turning agricultural surplus into public display. The palace gave offerings to the gods, distributed food, rewarded followers, and demonstrated that it could command resources from across the land. That was the promise of the system. The palace could organize abundance. But it also created dependence. The elite needed farmers to produce surplus. They needed herders to supply wool. They needed women workers to make textiles. They needed smiths to produce weapons and tools. They needed labourers to maintain roads, ports, storage rooms, walls and ships. And all of those people, in turn, may have depended on palace rations, palace protection, palace land grants, palace trade networks, and palace religious institutions. The gold buried with rulers came from the same system that counted sheep. The spears carried by warriors depended on the same networks that moved grain and wool. The grandeur of Mycenae rested not just on kings and heroes, but on thousands of ordinary lives coordinated through a fragile administrative machine, which meant that when that machine began to fail, the consequences would not be confined to the throne room. They would reach every field, every workshop, every sanctuary, and every village beyond the palace walls. That administrative machine did not fail all at once, at least not everywhere. For much of the 13th century BCE, the Mycenaean palace world was still powerful. Its rulers commanded labour, its workshops produced cloth, perfume, pottery, weapons, and luxury goods. Ships still crossed the Aegean, foreign objects still arrived in Greek ports. Palaces still recorded sheep, grain, bronze, and offerings to the gods. But beneath that surface, something was changing. The warning signs are not written as dramatic prophecies. No Mycenaean scribe left behind a tablet saying, "The end is near." What survives is more indirect. A wall made thicker, a gate made narrower, a settlement moved uphill, a hidden water supply cut into rock, a tablet recording men assigned to guard the coast. Each clue is small by itself. Together, they suggest a society becoming nervous. Take Mycenae itself. The citadel had always been built for defence. It stood on a steep rocky hill above the Argive plain, its massive walls visible for miles. But during the later 13th century BCE, the defences were expanded. New sections of Cyclopean wall enclosed a larger area of the ridge. The famous Lion Gate belongs to this world of fortified display, a gateway designed to impress anyone approaching the palace. But later builders did more than impress. They prepared. Inside the citadel, the Mycenaeans constructed an underground cistern, reached by a long descending passage hidden within the walls. The passage led deep into the rock, where water could be collected from a natural spring beyond the fortification line. Think about what that means. In peaceful times, people can walk down to a spring in the open countryside. They do not need to climb down a dark stairway beneath tons of stone just to fill a jar. A concealed water system makes most sense when the people inside the walls expect that leaving those walls may become dangerous. At Tiryns, another great argolid citadel, the pattern is similar. The walls were expanded and strengthened. Long covered galleries were built into the massive stonework. Hidden passages and protected access points gave defenders ways to move within the fortifications. Tiryns had always been imposing. By the end of the 13th century, it was becoming something more, a place prepared to endure threat. Other regions show their own signs of adjustment. In parts of Greece, settlements became more concentrated in defensible locations. Some communities favoured hills, ridges, and naturally protected sites. Some older places were abandoned while others grew. This does not necessarily mean that every village was fleeing an invading army. People move for many reasons: changing farmland, political reorganisation, local rivalry, trade opportunities, even shifts in population. But when fortified sites multiply, walls are repaired, and access to water is secured, it is hard to avoid the larger question. What were they afraid of? Maybe enemies from outside. Maybe raiders arriving by sea. Maybe rival Mycenaean kingdoms. Maybe communities that had once supplied the palace were now resisting its demands. Maybe the danger was not one thing at all, but a world becoming less predictable year by year. And the palaces had reason to worry, because their power depended on connections. Mycenaean Greece was not isolated behind its mountain walls. It was part of a vast Bronze Age network reaching across the eastern Mediterranean. Copper came from Cyprus. Tin, needed to make bronze, arrived through longer and more uncertain routes. Ivory, glass, precious metals, luxury goods, dyes, and prestige objects moved between Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, Cyprus, Crete, and the Aegean. A palace could not simply decide to make bronze if the copper ships stopped arriving. It could not equip warriors, reward followers, maintain workshops, or display wealth in the old way without those long-distance supply lines. And the more specialized the economy became, the more vulnerable it was to disruption. That does not mean international trade had already collapsed. Evidence from the late 13th century shows that exchange continued. Mycenaean pottery still travelled abroad. Imported goods still appeared in the Aegean. Great kingdoms such as Egypt and the Hittite Empire were still sending messages, gifts, and cargoes across the sea. But this was a network under pressure. The Hittite records from Anatolia describe a political world full of disputes, rebellious vassals, contested coastlines, piracy, military expeditions, and fragile alliances. Kingdoms were still functioning, but they were spending increasing energy simply holding their systems together. And Greece was connected to that same unstable world. If you enjoy these ancient mysteries, the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries goes even deeper into the questions history still cannot fully answer. You can find it on the website through the link in the description. Now, one of the most revealing clues comes from Pylos in southwestern Greece. The final linear B tablets from the palace appear to record emergency preparations. They mention coastal districts, local officials, rowers, and groups of men assigned to watch the shoreline. Scholars debate exactly what every line means. The tablets are fragmentary. The language is administrative. We cannot reconstruct the full crisis from a handful of clay records. But the basic image is striking. The Palace of Pylos, one of the richest and best organised centres in Mycenaean Greece, seems to have been mobilizing people near the coast shortly before its destruction. Were they expecting raiders? Were they guarding against an enemy fleet? Were they watching for a threat that had already struck somewhere else in the Aegean? We do not know. And this uncertainty matters. It is tempting to look at the fortifications, the cisterns, the watchmen, and the shifting settlements and turn them into one clean story. The Mycenaeans saw invaders coming. They built walls. They waited. Then they were overwhelmed. History is usually messier than that. A wall can be built because of war, but it can also be built because a ruler wants to demonstrate power. A water system can reflect fear of siege, but also practical planning for drought. A settlement can move uphill because of insecurity, but also because political authority has shifted from one local centre to another. And the evidence does not unfold at the same pace across Greece. Some palaces were destroyed earlier than others. Some settlements continued after nearby centres fell. Some regions may have suffered local disruption for decades before the palace system finally broke. Knossos on Crete had already lost its mainland-style palace administration long before Pylos burned. Thebes, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and smaller centres each had their own histories, their own rivalries, their own vulnerabilities. There was no single Mycenaean Greece reacting as one united nation. There were kingdoms, districts, villages, fortresses, families, rival elites, people who may not even have understood that they were living through the last years of an entire age. But by the end of the 13th century BCE, the signs were there. More walls, more controlled access, more concern for water, more evidence of mobilization, a palace economy dependent on resources it could not fully control, an international system showing cracks across the sea. The Mycenaeans may not have known exactly what was coming, but they may have known that something was wrong, and soon the warnings would become fire. And then, in the decades around 1200 BCE, the warnings became fire. At Pylos, the palace that had counted sheep, assigned workers, tracked offerings and organised entire districts was destroyed in a massive blaze. Roof timbers collapsed, rooms filled with ash and debris. The administrative centre never resumed its old life, and in one strange twist of archaeology, the fire that destroyed the palace also preserved its final words. Linear B tablets were not meant to last. They were usually made from damp clay, written quickly by scribes, then stored for temporary use. In normal conditions they would eventually have been recycled, dissolved, or discarded. But when the palace burned, the heat baked many of them hard. The same flames that ended the administration turned its paperwork into ceramic. That is why we can still read lists of workers, livestock, weapons, land, cloth, taxes, religious offerings, and emergency deployments more than 3,000 years later. The palace died in fire. Its records survived because of the fire. Pylos was not alone across mainland Greece. The great centres of the Mycenaean world suffered destruction, abandonment, reduction, or profound political change. Thebes, one of the major palace centres in Boeotia, had already experienced destructive episodes late in the 13th century BCE. Mycenae and Tiryns, the mighty fortified citadels of the Argolid, were damaged and transformed. Other centres that had once operated within the palace system disappeared from the administrative map altogether. But here is the part that makes this story harder and more interesting. They did not all fall on the same night. There was no single date when every Mycenaean palace erupted in flames. No evidence for one army marching from kingdom to kingdom, toppling every throne in perfect sequence. Some sites were destroyed earlier. Some continued in diminished form. Some were rebuilt after damage. Some citadels, including Mycenae and Tiryns, remained occupied into the next period, even after the old palace order had been shattered. This was not a light switch turning off. It was more like a network losing power, one station at a time. At first, perhaps one kingdom fails. A palace burns. Trade is interrupted. Refugees move. Rival rulers see an opportunity. Local communities stop delivering grain, labour, or taxes. Craftsmen lose access to supplies. Soldiers go unpaid. Then another centre weakens, and another. A system built on coordination begins to lose the ability to coordinate. The archaeological evidence is brutally physical. Burned layers, collapsed walls, smashed pottery, abandoned buildings. Storage rooms left beneath destruction debris. At several palace sites, linear B tablets appear in the final burned levels, preserved by accidental firing just as they were at Pylos. The tablets tell us something enormously important. By the end of the Bronze Age, palace administration ended across much of the mainland. Not necessarily every village, not every settlement, not every local leader, But the great bureaucratic machine was gone. The Wanax disappears from the records. The scribal offices disappear. The elaborate system that collected wool from one district, bronze from another, grain from another, and labour from thousands of people no longer functioned in the same way. Workshops tied to palace demand were disrupted. International exchange contracted. The world that had made Mycenaean kings powerful became much smaller, poorer, and more fragmented. And Greece was not collapsing in isolation. At almost the same time, the Eastern Mediterranean was going through one of the greatest political breakdowns in ancient history. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated much of Anatolia for centuries, vanished. Its capital at Hattusa was abandoned. The empire's royal archives fell silent. In the Levant, important coastal cities were destroyed, among them Ugarit, a wealthy port whose final letters speak of enemy ships, missing allies, and a crisis unfolding too fast for help to arrive. Cyprus, the island that supplied so much of the region's copper, saw destruction and upheaval at multiple sites. Egypt survived, but only after facing severe attacks and internal strain during the reigns of Meneptah and Ramesses III. Egyptian inscriptions describe groups arriving by land and sea, people later grouped under the famous label Sea Peoples. For generations, that phrase seemed to offer an easy answer. The Sea Peoples came, the Bronze Age collapsed, the Mycenaeans vanished. Simple, dramatic, wrong, or at least far too simple. The Egyptian texts are real. Raids and migrations were real. Warfare at sea was real, but the Sea Peoples was not one clearly identified nation with one clear plan. It was an Egyptian label for a collection of groups encountered in different conflicts. Some may have been raiders, some may have been displaced populations. Some may have included people from the Aegean, some may have been fighting because their own homes had already collapsed. They may have been a cause in some places, they may also have been a symptom. Imagine the entire Eastern Mediterranean as a web. Egypt, the Hittites, Cyprus, the Levant, the Aegean. Ships carrying metals, grain, soldiers, diplomats, merchants, refugees and messages between them. If drought reduces harvests in one region, grain prices rise somewhere else. If war disrupts a port, bronze becomes harder to obtain. If a kingdom loses control of its coast, piracy increases. If refugees arrive in a new land, local tensions rise. If one palace falls, its allies and trading partners lose more than goods. They lose predictability, and ancient states depended on predictability. They needed harvests to arrive, taxes to be collected, roads to remain open, ships to reach port, local elites to remain loyal, foreign rulers to honour agreements. A palace economy could survive one bad harvest. It might survive a raid, it might even survive an earthquake. But what if several disasters arrived close together? What if drought, crop failure, war, rebellion, population movement, trade disruption, and political rivalry began feeding into one another? Then even a powerful kingdom could become fragile very quickly. That is what Greece appears to have faced. We can say that palace centres burned. We can say that their administrations stopped functioning. We can say that the wider Bronze Age world around them was breaking apart. We can say that recovery, where it happened, did not restore the old system. But we cannot yet say with certainty who set fire to Pylos. We cannot name the people responsible for every destruction layer at Mycenae, Tiryns or Thebes. We cannot prove that one invasion destroyed all the palaces. We cannot rule out internal revolt, civil conflict, earthquake damage, famine, or rulers losing control of the very communities they had once commanded. The evidence gives us the ruins. The cause remains a crime scene with too many suspects. And the biggest mystery is not simply why the palaces fell. It is why, once they fell, nobody rebuilt the world they had lost. So who did it? For a long time, historians thought they had a clean answer. The Dorians. According to the traditional story, a new Greek-speaking people from the north swept down into southern Greece after 1200 BCE. They were supposedly tougher, poorer, more warlike, perhaps armed with iron weapons, and they overwhelmed the older Mycenaean kingdoms. The great palaces fell, the descendants of the defeated kings fled east across the Aegean, and the Dorians took over the ruins. It is a powerful story. It explains why later Greek dialects were different in different regions. It fits ancient traditions about migrations, and for generations it gave the collapse a simple human face: invasion. But archaeology has made that answer much harder to defend. There is no clear line of Dorian destruction moving across Greece. No unmistakable new material culture appearing everywhere immediately after the palaces burn. No archaeological moment where we can point to a layer of ash and say, this is where the Dorians arrived. Even the word Dorian comes from much later Greek history. Classical Greeks knew that some communities spoke Doric dialects. They told stories about the return of the Heraclids, the descendants of Heracles reclaiming the Peloponnese. But those stories were written down centuries after the collapse. They may preserve distant memories of migration and conflict. They may also be later Greeks trying to explain why the world they lived in looked different from the world described in heroic legend. And there is another problem. If invading Dorians destroyed Mycenaean Greece, where were they before the invasion? What made them suddenly capable of conquering fortified kingdoms with chariots, armies, storerooms, and massive stone citadels? Ironically, the evidence suggests that some population movement probably did happen after the collapse. People fled destroyed districts, communities shifted into defensible locations, new groups may have entered regions emptied by war, hunger, or political breakdown. But migration after a collapse is not the same thing as a single invasion that caused it. The Dorians may be part of the aftermath. They are much harder to prove as the trigger. Then there are the Sea Peoples. Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III describe foreign groups attacking Egypt by land and sea around 1177 BCE. The reliefs show ships, warriors, carts, families and livestock. Not just raiders apparently, but populations on the move. The names include the Peliset, often linked with the later Philistines, along with groups called the Sherdan, Shekelish, Denyen, and others. Some scholars have wondered whether the Denyen were connected to the Danaians, one of Homer's names for the Greeks. Others have connected different Sea Peoples groups with the Aegean, Western Anatolia, Sicily, Sardinia, or Cyprus. Maybe some were Mycenaeans, maybe some were refugees from Mycenaean territories. Maybe some were enemies of the Mycenaeans who had learned that the old powers were vulnerable. But the Egyptian evidence does not show a Sea People's army marching into Pylos, Mycenae or Tiryns, and burning the palaces. It shows Egypt fighting mobile groups during a period of enormous regional upheaval. Those groups could have spread destruction. They could have disrupted shipping. They could have cut off food and metal supplies, but they do not solve every local mystery in Greece. And then there is the Earth itself. Greece sits on one of the most seismically active regions in Europe. Earthquakes are not hypothetical there. They are a fact of life. A major quake can crack walls, topple storeroom shelves, collapse roofs, destroy roads, damage harbours, and turn a fortified citadel into a trap of falling stone. At several Mycenaean sites, archaeologists have proposed earthquake damage. Tilted walls, collapsed masonry, debris patterns that might fit a sudden seismic event. But might is the important word. A building that has burned, been looted, rebuilt, abandoned, exposed to rain for 3,000 years, and excavated in fragments does not always reveal exactly how it fell. Fire can collapse walls. Warfare can break foundations. Later rebuilding can obscure earlier damage, and an earthquake, even a devastating one, does not explain why palace administration vanished across such a wide area, unless it struck at exactly the wrong moment. Picture a kingdom already under pressure. Harvests are weak, grain stores are low, coastal raiding has increased. Bronze is becoming harder to acquire because ships are no longer arriving reliably from Cyprus or beyond. Then an earthquake damages the palace, the roads, the harbour, the storage facilities, maybe even the walls that made the ruler look invincible. The physical damage is bad, the loss of confidence may be worse. And food may have been the central issue. Climate records from caves, lake sediments, pollen, and ancient shorelines suggest that parts of the eastern Mediterranean experienced periods of drying around the end of the Bronze Age. But the evidence is uneven. Not every region became dry at the same time. Not every drought lasted equally long. We cannot say that one giant drought killed the Mycenaean world. What we can say is that palace societies depended on agricultural surplus. They needed grain not just to feed farmers but to support scribes, warriors, craftspeople, religious personnel, rowers, labour gangs and elite households. A few poor harvests could force impossible decisions. Who gets fed first? The villagers, the army, the palace workers? The refugees arriving at the gates? Famine also brings disease. Malnutrition weakens people, crowded settlements spread infection. Moving populations carry pathogens into communities with little resistance. Disease almost never leaves a clear archaeological signature, unless bodies survive under extraordinary conditions. So it remains one of the hardest suspects to catch. But invisible does not mean unimportant. Then comes the problem of bronze. The Mycenaean world ran on it. Weapons, tools, fittings, vessels, prestige goods. Bronze required copper and tin in particular had to travel long distances through fragile trade networks. Break the routes, lose access to ports, or watch foreign kingdoms collapse, and suddenly a palace cannot equip its soldiers or reward its followers in the old way. A king who cannot distribute resources is not simply poorer, he is less powerful. That leads to perhaps the most uncomfortable possibility of all. What if the palaces were destroyed, at least in part, by their own people? The Linear B tablets reveal a society organised from above. The palace assessed land, demanded labour, controlled key industries, collected goods, mobilised personnel, and kept close track of what communities owed. That system was efficient when it worked. It could concentrate resources with astonishing power. But centralised systems have a weakness. They concentrate failure too. If a local village refuses deliveries, the palace notices. If an official defects, the palace notices. If elite families begin competing for the throne, control of the storehouses becomes a military prize. If farmers believe the palace cannot protect them, taxation begins to look less like order and more like extraction. Some destruction layers may preserve evidence of attack. But attack by whom? Foreign invaders? Rival kingdoms? Local rebels, palace guards turning against their ruler? We usually cannot tell. A burning citadel does not identify the hand that lit the fire. Maybe there was no single hand. Maybe the Mycenaean collapse was what happens when every pressure arrives together. Drought reduces food. Food shortages drive movement. Movement creates conflict. Conflict disrupts trade. Trade failure cuts bronze supplies. Elite competition grows sharper. Earthquakes damage already strained infrastructure. Raiding increases. Communities stop trusting the palace. The palace responds by demanding more, and every attempt to save the system, makes the system less stable. That is not one disaster, it is a chain reaction. The palaces had been built to command a connected world. When that world became dangerous, unpredictable, and poor, their size may have become a liability. A small village could adapt. It could move, hide grain, change crops, follow a local leader. A palace had storerooms, officials, dependent workers, armies, obligations, and enemies. It needed the whole machine to keep running, and once enough parts failed, the machine did not bend. It broke. But did it really happen in a single generation? The answer depends on what we mean by it. If we mean the palace system, then yes, something remarkably fast happened. Within a relatively short stretch of archaeological time, the centres that had governed Mycenaean Greece stopped functioning as centres of government. The archives went silent. The storerooms stopped receiving goods. The officials disappear from the written record. The Wanax, the palace king, vanishes. But if we mean the people of Greece, then no, they did not simply disappear into smoke. And that distinction changes everything. Archaeology works on a different clock from human memory. A destruction layer can sometimes be dated within a few decades. But when archaeologists say the Mycenaean palace world collapsed around 1200 BCE, they are describing a process spread across generations, perhaps 50 years, perhaps more, varying from region to region. To someone living through it, that would still have felt sudden. Imagine being born in a world of palaces, scribes, armed retainers, taxes, festivals, workshops and rulers, whose authority seemed as solid as the Cyclopean walls around Mycenae. Then, by middle age, the palace is burned, the tablets are gone, the king is gone. The people who once measured your land, claimed your wool, summoned your labour, and recorded your obligations no longer exist as a functioning government. That is a collapse. Not because every village died, because the system that connected villages to a central authority died. The Linear B tablets make this painfully clear. They survive only because fire baked the clay hard enough to preserve it. And then, after the destruction of the palaces, they stop. Not gradually becoming less elegant, not evolving into a simpler written script. They stop. For centuries afterward, Greece has no surviving writing at all. That does not necessarily mean that every Mycenaean could read before the collapse. Most probably could not. Writing was a palace tool used by a small administrative class for lists, rations, land, animals, offerings, weapons, and labour. But when the palaces fell, writing fell with them because the institutions that needed it were gone. A society that had once counted thousands of jars and sheep could no longer, or no longer chose to, keep records in the old way. That is how complete the political break was. But the ruins do not show Greece becoming instantly empty. After the major palace destructions, Mycenaean material culture continued. Archaeologists call this final phase Late Helladic Secundae. The name sounds technical, but the reality was human. Communities kept building houses, potters kept making vessels in recognizable Mycenaean styles, metal workers continued producing tools and weapons. People still buried their dead, still gathered for feasts, still traded, still defended settlements. The old palace world was gone, but its survivors were still living in its shadow. In some places, life became smaller and more local. Settlements shifted to hills, ridges, and other defensible ground. Some communities rebuilt after destruction. Others moved away from exposed plains and coasts. Some regions seem to have suffered severe depopulation. Others held on surprisingly well. At Tiryns, for example, occupation continued after the palace's destruction, and parts of the citadel were reused. In Achaia, in the northwest Peloponnese, many sites seem to have remained active or even gained importance during the post-palatial period. On islands and in coastal regions, evidence points to movement, contact, and adaptation rather than a simple end. This was not one Greece experiencing one fate. It was a fractured landscape. Some communities burned, some fled, some endured, some may have absorbed refugees from nearby districts. Some may have become powerful precisely because the old palace centres no longer dominated them. And the people themselves carried more continuity than the ruins first suggest. They still spoke Greek. We cannot listen to their voices, of course. But Linear B records an early form of Greek, and later Greek dialects emerge from the same linguistic world. The language changed over time, as all languages do. New dialects spread. Population movements likely reshaped the map. But there is no sign that Greek vanished from Greece and was replaced wholesale by an entirely different language. Even some divine names survived the fall of the palaces. The Linear B tablets mention Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, Dionysus, and other figures recognizable from later Greek religion. Their roles were not always identical. Poseidon, for instance, seems enormously important in the Mycenaean records, perhaps more central than he would later become in some Greek cities. Religious practices changed, sanctuaries changed, myths changed. But the names endured. That matters. It suggests that beneath the destruction of the palaces, communities preserved memories, rituals, stories, and identities that did not depend entirely on royal administration. Craft traditions survived too. Pottery styles evolved, but they did not begin from nothing. Techniques for working clay, stone, wood, and metal passed from older hands to younger ones. The great palace workshops may have collapsed, yet skilled people did not vanish simply because an archive stopped recording their output. The same is true of settlement. Some places were abandoned, yes. The archaeological map of Greece after 1200 BCE is thinner. There are fewer large sites, fewer rich tombs, fewer monumental buildings, fewer imported luxuries. Population probably declined in many areas through hunger, violence, flight, disease, and migration. But thinner is not empty. For generations, the phrase Greek Dark Age encouraged a picture of abandoned landscapes and forgotten people wandering through the ruins of civilization. There was real loss, real isolation, real poverty compared with the Palace Age. But darkness is not emptiness. People still farmed. They herded animals, they fished, they made tools. They buried family members. They defended small communities. They sailed when they could, and some left. Groups from mainland Greece and the Aegean moved eastward toward the coast of Anatolia, the islands, Cyprus, and the Levant. These migrations may have included refugees, traders, warriors, families, and communities looking for land after the old order failed. Later Greek tradition remembered some of these movements as the settlement of Ionia and Aeolis. The traditions were written down much later, so they cannot be treated like eyewitness reports. But archaeology does show that the Aegean remained connected to the Eastern Mediterranean, even if those connections were weaker, riskier, and transformed. So did the Mycenaean Empire vanish in a generation. First, it was never really an empire in the modern sense. Mycenaean Greece was a world of competing palace kingdoms, sometimes allied, sometimes hostile, linked by trade, diplomacy, and shared culture. What vanished was the palace order. Its kings, scribes, taxes, workshops, storerooms, and command structure disappeared with astonishing speed. The political machine broke so thoroughly that Greece would not use writing again for centuries. But the people were still there. They were the farmers beyond the walls, the potters who remembered old techniques, the families who carried Greek words and divine names into a harsher age, the refugees who crossed the sea, the survivors who rebuilt on hillsides and among ruins. The palaces died. Greece did not. And that is where the long road begins. Not the road from Mycenae directly to Athens, not a clean line from the Wanax to the Democratic Assembly, from palace warriors to Spartan hoplites, from linear B tablets to the plays of Sophocles. That is the story people often imagine because classical Greece feels so familiar. Temples, philosophers, Olympic athletes, city-states fighting one another across the mountains and sea. But between the burning of the palaces and the rise of Athens and Sparta lie centuries of transformation, centuries in which Greece became smaller, poorer in some ways, more fragmented, and fundamentally different. For a long time, historians called this period the Greek Dark Age, roughly from the 12th century BCE to the 8th. The name was understandable. The palace archives had vanished. Monumental building became rare. Long-distance trade shrank. Rich graves became less common in many regions, and most strikingly, writing disappeared. Not just linear B writing itself. Imagine that. Your grandparents might have lived in a world where palace officials tracked grain, livestock, weapons, land, cloth, and labour on clay tablets. Then the palaces fall, the scribes lose their jobs, their institutions, perhaps their lives. The tablets stop being made, and for generations after generations, nobody in Greece leaves behind written records we can read. No laws carved in stone, no royal proclamations, no lists of rulers, no letters, no histories. The silence is real, but archaeologists increasingly qualify the phrase Dark Age because darkness can mean two very different things. It can mean that people themselves vanished into ignorance, or it can mean that our evidence becomes harder to see. The second is much closer to the truth. There is a Dark Age in the record because there are fewer texts. But there was no Dark Age in the sense of empty land and empty minds. People were still making decisions. They were adapting to damaged landscapes, shifting trade routes, lost political systems, and new threats. They were rebuilding life without the old machinery of the palace. And they did not rebuild it the same way. The Mycenaean world had been organised around major centres, palaces that collected goods, controlled labour, sponsored elite craft production, and claimed authority over large territories. After the collapse, that scale mostly disappears. Settlements tend to become smaller. More local, often more defensible. People moved onto hilltops, ridges, and naturally protected places. Not every community did this, and not every move was caused by warfare. But the pattern tells us something. Security mattered. A village on a high slope could see danger coming. A community near a fortified hill had somewhere to retreat. In a world without palace armies and central storage systems, survival depended more heavily on what your own community could defend. Leadership changed too. The Wanax vanished from the historical record. So did the elaborate hierarchy beneath him, the scribes, regional officials, and palace administrators, with titles preserved in Linear B. Later Greeks still used the word basileus, often translated as king. But the early Iron Age basileus was probably nothing like a Mycenaean Wanax. Think less of a ruler commanding a bureaucratic kingdom, and more of a local big man, a war leader, a wealthy household head, someone whose influence depended on land, livestock, followers, feast-giving, fighting ability, family connections, and the reputation he could build in person. Power had become face-to-face. You could not send an order through a chain of palace officials if there were no officials left. You had to persuade relatives, reward companions, feed guests, lead raids, settle disputes, prove constantly that people had a reason to listen to you. Burial customs reveal this new world of local status and competition. The great Mycenaean shaft graves and tholos tombs did not simply continue as before. In many places, burial became less lavish. Cremation became more common in some regions, especially later in the period, while elsewhere people continued to bury bodies intact. Grave goods varied enormously. A few individuals received weapons, ornaments, imported objects, or fine pottery. Many did not. That unevenness matters. It suggests societies where rank still existed, but where wealth and authority were being renegotiated. No palace was issuing a single official image of power. Different communities were developing their own customs, their own leaders, their own claims to prestige. And then there was iron. Iron did not suddenly replace bronze the day the palaces burned. Early iron was difficult to produce and initially scarce. Bronze remained useful for many things, but over the following centuries, iron tools and weapons became more widespread. This changed the economic landscape. Bronze depended on copper and tin, materials often obtained through long-distance trade networks. Iron ore was more widely available in Greece itself, though turning it into usable metal required skill, fuel, and high temperatures. As old trade routes became unreliable, iron offered communities a resource. They could increasingly work closer to home. It did not make everyone rich, but it made local production more possible. A village no longer needed to stand at the end of a palace-controlled network to equip farmers or warriors. Smiths could become important figures in small communities. Tools could circulate through local exchange. Weapons could be made and repaired without access to the international supply chains that had once fed the Bronze Age palaces. This was a harsher world, but it was also a more decentralized one. Trade did not disappear either. It narrowed, shifted, then slowly expanded again. People exchanged pottery, metal, livestock, food, raw materials, and prestige goods between neighboring regions. Seaborne contact continued across the Aegean. Cyprus remained important. Links with the Levant revived in new forms. By the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, Greek communities were once again plugged into a wider Mediterranean world. And with those connections came new ideas. Perhaps the most important was a new way of writing. Sometime in the 8th century BCE, Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet. This was not Linear B returning after a long sleep. It was a different system, borrowed and transformed. The Phoenician script was designed for a Semitic language, mainly recording consonants. Greek speakers adapted some of its signs to represent vowels. That was a brilliant change. For the first time, Greek writing could record Greek speech with remarkable flexibility. And unlike Linear B, which had been tied to palace accounting, alphabetic writing spread into a world without palaces. It appeared on drinking cups, ownership marks, dedications, and eventually laws, poetry, public records, and political debate. Writing had returned, but it returned to a transformed Greece. Before it returned, something else may have carried the past across the centuries: oral poetry. We cannot prove that a single singer preserved a continuous memory of the Mycenaean age from 1200 BCE to Homer's world. That would be too simple. Oral traditions change every time they are performed. Stories merge, names shift, old weapons become new ones. A memory of palace kings can be reshaped by generations who have never seen a palace functioning. But the Homeric poems seem to preserve fragments of a distant Bronze Age world. They remember Mycenae as rich in gold. They remember a powerful king at Pylos. They tell of boars' tusk helmets, chariot warriors, great halls and expeditions across the sea. Some of these details resemble Mycenaean archaeology. Others belong clearly to the later world in which the poems took shape. The poems are not archives. They are not eyewitness reports of Troy. They are cultural memory, a vast collage made from inherited stories, real places, heroic fantasies, and the concerns of later Greeks trying to understand where they came from. And that matters because the Greeks of the city-state age did not see themselves as beginning from nothing. They looked back toward an age of heroes, kings, sieges, and ruined cities. They stood among Cyclopean walls whose builders seemed superhuman. They found old tombs, old weapons, old place names. They inherited fragments and turned them into legend. Then, gradually, new political forms emerged. The polis, the city-state, was not a restored Mycenaean kingdom. Athens was not Mycenae with better architecture. Sparta was not a surviving palace regime. These communities developed from smaller settlements, regional identities, aristocratic households, sanctuaries, warfare, trade, colonization, and new forms of collective organization. In some places, elites dominated. In others, broader bodies of citizens gained influence. Laws became public. Assemblies mattered. Military service changed political expectations. Colonies carried Greek language and institutions across the Mediterranean. Athens would eventually experiment with democracy. Sparta would build its extraordinary and brutal military society. But neither was the direct continuation of the world ruled by the Wanax. Classical Greece arose from the ruins of the palace age, carrying its language, gods, stories, and scattered memories. Yet its politics were new, its writing was new, its institutions were new. Its world was built not by restoring the old Bronze Age order, but by surviving its destruction and creating something no Mycenaean king would have recognized. And that brings us back to the world that existed before Athens and Sparta. The world Greece remembered but could no longer fully explain. Mycenaean Greece was not merely the opening act before the real story began. It was not a primitive version of the classical city-state, waiting to become Athens, Sparta, or Corinth. It was a network of formidable palace kingdoms: Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes, Knossos in its earlier Mycenaean phase. Centres ruled by elites who built massive fortifications, organised labour, stored agricultural surplus, armed warriors, and sent goods across the sea. They were rivals as much as allies. They did not form one unified Greek nation. But they shared a language, a palace culture, military traditions and connections that stretched across the Bronze Age Mediterranean. And unlike the heroes of later legend, these rulers left traces. Not stories written centuries afterward, administrative tablets baked hard when the buildings around them burned. Lists of sheep, grain, oil, bronze, cloth, chariots, personnel, religious offerings and weapons. Linear B gives us a brief accidental view inside the machinery of power. It shows a world where bureaucracy mattered. The Wanax was not simply a warrior with a sword. He stood at the centre of an institution. Officials recorded obligations. Specialised workers produced goods. Local communities supplied labour and resources. The palace gathered, redistributed, rewarded, and commanded. But the tablets also reveal anxiety. Coastal watches, weapons inventories, chariot equipment, emergency preparations. In the final years, some palace states seem to have been bracing for danger they could see coming, even if we cannot say exactly what that danger was. Then the system broke. Palaces burned, archives ended. Long-distance exchange contracted, political authority fragmented, and within what may have been a single lifetime in some regions, the world of the Wanax was gone. Was it invasion, internal rebellion, earthquakes, drought, raiding, famine, a wider collapse of trade and diplomatic networks? Probably no single explanation fits every site. The evidence points toward a crisis made worse by interconnected systems. When trade failed, bronze became harder to acquire. When harvests failed, palaces had less to redistribute. When authority weakened, rivals and local communities had reasons to resist. When violence came, a system built around a few major centres had few ways to absorb the shock. That is why the Mycenaean story still matters. Complex societies can look permanent. Their walls are huge, their records are detailed, their rulers command armies. Their trade reaches distant lands. From the outside they can seem unbreakable, but connection is both strength and vulnerability. The palace kingdoms became powerful because everything flowed through their networks. Goods, labour, information, authority, prestige. And when those networks failed, the same complexity that created power may have made recovery harder. Centuries later, Greeks stood before the ruins. They saw walls made from stones so enormous that they believed Cyclopes must have built them. They remembered golden Mycenae, powerful Pylos, kings, ships, heroes, and a war at Troy. But the palace offices were silent, the tablets were unreadable. The world behind the legends had vanished. All that remained were broken citadels, buried tombs, and fragments of memory. If you enjoyed this journey into the forgotten warrior kingdoms of Greece, please like, comment, and subscribe. And tell us where you're listening from. The best way to support the channel is by listening on Spotify through the link in the description.